Once more, the drama begins. The Emperor Paul Muad'Dib, on his ascension to the Lion Throne. Alia peered down from her spy window into the great reception hall to watch the advance of the guild entourage. The sharply silver light of noon poured through clear-story windows onto a floor worked in green, blue, and eggshell tiles to simulate a bayou with water plants, and here and there a splash of exotic colour to indicate bird or animal. Guildsmen moved across the tile pattern like hunters stalking their prey in a strange jungle. They formed a moving design of grey robes, black robes, orange robes, all arrayed in a deceptively random way around the transparent tank where the steersman ambassador swam in his orange gas. The tank slid on its supporting field, towed by two grey-robed attendants like a rectangular ship being warped into its dock. Directly beneath her, Paul sat on the lion throne on its raised dais. He wore the new formal crown of its fish and fist emblems. The jeweled golden robes of state covered his body. The shimmering of a personal shield surrounded him. Two wings of bodyguards fanned out on both sides along the dais and down the steps. Steelguard stood 2 steps below Paul's right hand in a white robe with a yellow rope for a belt. Sibling Emberfeet told her that Paul seethed of the same agitation she was experiencing, although she doubted another could detect it. His attention remained on an orange-robed attendant whose blindly staring metal eyes looked neither to right nor to left. This attendant walked at the right front corner of the ambassador's troop like a military outrider, a rather flat face beneath curly black hair, such of his figure as could be seen beneath the orange robe. Every gesture shouted a familiar identity. It was Duncan Idaho. It could not be Duncan Idaho, yet it was. Captive memories absorbed in the womb during the moment of her mother's spice change identified this man for Alia by a Rahani decipherment which cut through all camouflage. Paul was seeing him, she knew, out of countless personal experiences, out of gratitude and youthful sharing. It was Duncan. Alia shuddered. There could be only one answer. This was a Tleilaxu Gola, a being reconstructed from the dead flesh of the original. The original had perished saving Paul. This could only be a product of the axolotl tanks. The Gola walked with the cock-footed alertness of a master swordsman. He came to a halt as the ambassador's tank glided to a stop 10 paces from the steps of the dais. In the Bene Gesserit way she could not escape, Alia read Paul's disquiet. He no longer looked at the figure out of his past. Not looking, his whole being stared. Muscles strained against restrictions as he nodded to the guild ambassador, said, "I am told your name is Edric. We welcome you to our court in the hope that this will bring new understanding between us." The steersman assumed a sybaritic reclining pose in his orange gas, popped a melange capsule in his mouth before meeting Paul's gaze. The tiny transducer orbiting a corner of the guildsman's tank reproduced a coughing sound. From the rasping, uninvolved voice, "I abase myself before my emperor and beg leave to present my credentials and offer a small gift." An aide passed a scroll up to Stilgar, who studied it, scowling, then nodded to Paul. Both Stilgar and Paul turned then toward the Gola standing patiently below the dais. "Indeed, my emperor has discerned the gift," Edric said. "We are pleased to accept your credentials," Paul said. "Explain the gift." Edric rolled in the tank, bringing his attention to bear on the Gola. "This is a man called Hate," he said, spelling the name. "According to our investigators, he has a most curious history. He was killed here on Arrakis, a grievous head wound which required many months of regrowth. The body was sold to the Bene Tleilax as that of a master swordsman, an adept of the Girnaz school. It came to our attention that this must be Duncan Idaho, the trusted retainer of your household. We bought him as a gift befitting an emperor." Edric peered up at Paul. "Is it not Idaho, sire?" Restraint and caution gripped Paul's voice. "He has the aspect of Idaho. Does Paul see something I don't?" Alia wondered. "No, it's Duncan." The man called Hate stood impassively, metal eyes fixed straight ahead, body relaxed. No sign escaped him to indicate he knew himself to be the object of discussion. "According to our best knowledge, it's Idaho," Edric said. "He's called Hate now," Paul said. "A curious name." "Sire, there's no divining how or why the Tleilaxu bestow names," Edric said, "but names can be changed. The Tleilaxu name is of little importance. This is a Tleilaxu thing," Paul thought. There's the problem. The Bene Tleilax had held little attachment to phenomenal nature. Good and evil carried strange meanings in their philosophy. What might they have incorporated in Idaho's flesh, out of design or whim? Paul glanced at Stilgar, noted the Fremen's superstitious awe. It was an emotion echoed all through his Fremen guard. Stilgar's mind would be speculating about the loathsome habits of guildsmen, of Tleilaxu, and of Golas. Turning towards the Gola, Paul said, "Hate, is that your only name?" A serene smile spread over the Gola's dark features. The metal eyes lifted, centered on Paul, but maintained their mechanical stare. "That is how I am called, my lord. Hayat." In her dark spy hole, Alia trembled. It was Idaho's voice, a quality of sound so precise she sensed its imprint upon her cells. "May it please my lord," the Gola added, "if I say his voice gives me pleasure." "This is a sign," said the Bene Tleilax, "that I have heard the voice before. But you don't know this for sure," Paul said. I know nothing of my past for sure, my lord. It was explained that I can have no memory of my former life. All that remains from before is the pattern set by the genes. There are, however, niches into which once familiar things may fit. There are voices, places, foods, faces, sounds, actions, a sword in my hand, the controls of a thopter. Noting how intently the guildsmen watched this exchange, Paul asked, "Do you understand that you're a gift?" "It was explained to me, my lord." Paul sat back, hands resting on the arms of the throne. "What debt do I owe Duncan's flesh?" he wondered. "The man died saving my life, but this is not Idaho. This is a Gola." Yet here were body and mind which had taught Paul to fly a thopter, as though the wings grew from his own shoulders. Paul knew he could not pick up a sword without leaning on the harsh education Idaho had given him. A Gola. This was flesh full of false impressions, easily misread. Old associations would persist. Duncan, Idaho. It wasn't so much a mask the Gola wore as it was a loose, concealing garment of personality which moved in a way different from whatever the Tleilaxu had hidden here. "How might you serve us?" Paul asked. "In any way my lord's wishes and my capabilities agree." Alia, watching from her vantage point, was touched by the Gola's air of diffidence. She detected nothing feigned. Something ultimately innocent shone from the new Duncan, Idaho. The original had been worldly, devil-may-care, but this flesh had been cleansed of all that. It was a pure surface upon which the Tleilaxu had written... what? She sensed the hidden perils in this gift then. This was a Tleilaxu thing. The Tleilaxu displayed a disturbing lack of inhibitions in what they created. Unbridled curiosity might guide their actions. They boasted they could make anything from the proper human raw material, devils or saints. They sold killer mentats. They'd produced a killer medic, overcoming the sook inhibitions against the taking of human life to do it. Their wares included willing menials, pliant sex toys for any whim, soldiers, generals, philosophers, even an occasional moralist. Paul stirred, looked at Edric. "How has this gift been trained?" he asked. "If it please my lord," Edric said, "it amused the Tleilaxu to train this Gola as a mentat and philosopher of the Zansuni. Thus they sought to increase his abilities with the sword." "Did they succeed?" "I do not know, my lord." Paul weighed the answer. Truth sense told him Edric sincerely believed the Gola to be Idaho, but there was more. The waters of time through which this oracular steersman moved suggested dangers without revealing them. Hate. The Tleilaxu name spoke of peril. Paul felt himself tempted to reject the gift. Even as he felt the temptation, he knew he couldn't choose that way. This flesh made demands on House Atreides, a fact the enemy well knew. "Zansuni philosopher," Paul mused, once more looking at the Gola. "You've examined your own role and motives? I approach my service in an attitude of humility, sire. I am a cleansed mind washed free of the imperatives from my human past. Would you prefer we called you Hayat or Duncan, Idaho? My lord may call me what he wishes, for I am not a name. But do you enjoy the name Duncan, Idaho?" "I think that was my name, sire. It fits within me, yet it stirs up curious responses. One's name, I think, must carry much that's unpleasant along with the pleasant." "What gives you the most pleasure?" Paul asked. Unexpectedly the Gola laughed, said, "Looking for signs in others which reveal my former self. Do you see such signs here?" "Oh, yes, my lord. Your man Stilgar is caught between suspicion and admiration. He was friend to my former self, but this Gola flesh repels him. You, my lord, admired the man I was, and you trusted him." "Cleansed mind," Paul said. "How can a cleansed mind put itself in bondage to us?" "Bondage, my lord? The cleansed mind makes decisions in the presence of unknowns and without cause and effect. Is this bondage?" Paul scowled. It was a Zansuni saying, cryptic, apt, immersed in a creed which denied objective function in all mental activity, without cause and effect. Such thoughts shocked the mind. Unknowns? Unknowns lay in every decision, even in the oracular vision. "You'd prefer we called you Duncan, Idaho?" Paul asked. "We live by differences, my lord. Choose a name for me." "Let your Tleilaxu name stand," Paul said. "Hayat. There's a name inspires caution." Hayat bowed, moved back one step, and Alia wondered, how did he know the interview was over? "I knew it because I knew my brother. I knew it because I know my brother, but there was no sign a stranger could read. Did the Duncan, Idaho in him know?" Paul turned toward the ambassador, said, "Quarters have been set aside for your embassy. It is our desire to have a private consultation with you at the earliest opportunity. We will send for you. Let us inform you further, before you hear it from an inaccurate source, that a reverend mother of the sisterhood, Gaius Helen Mahaim, has been removed from the high liner which brought you. It was done at our command. Her presence on your ship will be an item in our talks." A wave of Paul's left hand dismissed the envoy. "Hayat," Paul said. "Stay here." The ambassador's attendants backed away, towing the tank. Edric became orange motion and orange gas. Eyes, a mouth, gently waving limbs. Paul watched until the last guildsman was gone, the great door swinging closed behind them. "I've done it now," Paul thought. "I've accepted the Gola." The Tleilaxu creation was bait, no doubt of it. Very likely the old hag of her reverend mother played the same role, but it was the time of the tarot which he'd forecast in an early vision. The damnable tarot. It muddied the waters of time until the prescient strained to detect moments but an hour off. Many a fish took the bait and escaped, he reminded himself, and the tarot worked for him as well as against him. What he could not see, others might not detect as well. The Gola stood, head cocked to one side, waiting. Stilgar moved across the steps, hid the Gola from Paul's view. In Shekobsa, the hunting language of their siege days, Stilgar said, "That creature in the tank gives me the shudders, sire, but this gift, send it away." In the same tongue, Paul said, "I cannot. Idaho's dead," Stilgar argued. "This isn't Idaho. Let me take its water for the tribe. The Gola is my problem still. Your problem is our prisoner. I want the Reverend Mother guarded most carefully by the men I trained to resist the wilds of voice. I like this not, sire. I'll be cautious still. See that you are too." "Very well, sire." Stilgar stepped down to the floor of the hall, passed close to Hayat, sniffed him and strode out. Evil can be detected by its smell, Paul thought. Stilgar had planted the green and white Atreides banner on a dozen worlds, but remained superstitious Fremen, proof against any sophistication. Paul studied the gift. "Duncan, Duncan," he whispered, "what have they done to you?" "They gave me life, my lord," Hayat said. "But why were you trained and given to us?" Paul asked. Hayat pursed his lips. They intend me to destroy you." The statement's candour shook Paul. But then, how else could a Zen-Sunni Mentat respond? Even in a Gola, a Mentat could speak no less than the truth, especially out of Zen-Sunni inner calm. This was a human computer, mind and nervous system fitted to the tasks relegated long ago to hated mechanical devices. To condition him also as a Zen-Sunni meant a double ration of honesty, unless the Tleilaxu had built something even more odd into this flesh. Why, for example, the mechanical eyes? Tleilaxu boasted their metal eyes improved on the original. Strange, then, that more Tleilaxu didn't wear them out of choice. Paul glanced up at Alia's spy hole, longed for her presence and advice, for counsel not clouded by feelings of responsibility and debt. Once more he looked at the Gola. This was no frivolous gift. It gave honest answers to dangerous questions. It makes no difference that I know this is a weapon to be used against me, Paul thought. What should I do to protect myself from you? Paul asked. It was direct speech, no royal we, but a question as he might have put it to the old Duncan Idaho. "Send me away, my lord." Paul shook his head from side to side. "How are you to destroy me?" Hayat looked at the guards, who'd moved closer to Paul after Stilgar's departure. He turned, cast his gaze around the hall, brought his metal eyes back to bear on Paul, nodded. "This is a place where a man draws away from people," Hayat said. "It speaks of such power that one can contemplate it comfortably only in the remembrance that all things are finite. Did my lord's oracular powers plot his course into this place?" Paul drummed his fingers against the throne's arms. The Mentat sought data, but the question disturbed him. "I came to this position by strong decisions, not always out of my other abilities." "Strong decisions," Hayat said. "These temper a man's life. One can take the temper that from fine metal by heating it and allowing it to cool without quenching." "Do you divert me with Zen-Sunni prattle?" Paul asked. "Zen-Sunni has other avenues to explore, sire, than diversion and display." Paul wet his lips with his tongue, drew in a deep breath, set his own thoughts into the counterbalanced poise of the Mentat. Negative answers arose around him. It wasn't expected that he'd go harrying after the Gola to the exclusion of other duties. No, that wasn't it. Why a Zen-Sunni Mentat? Philosophy, words, contemplation, inward searching. He felt the weakness of his data. "We need more data," he muttered. "The facts needed by a Mentat do not brush off onto one as you might gather pollen on your robe while passing through a field of flowers," Hayat said. "One chooses his pollen carefully, examines it under powerful amplification." "You must teach me the Zen-Sunni way with rhetoric," Paul said. The metallic eyes glittered at him for a moment, then, "My lord, perhaps that's what was intended. To blunt my will with words and ideas," Paul wondered. "Ideas are most to be feared when they become actions," Paul said. "Send me away, sire," Hayat said, and it was Duncan Idaho's voice full of concern for the young master. Paul felt trapped by that voice. He couldn't send that voice away, even when it came from a Gola. "You will stay," he said, "and we'll both exercise caution." Hayat bowed in submission. Paul glanced up at the spy hole, eyes pleading for Alia to take this gift off his hands and ferret out its secrets. Golas were ghosts to frighten children. He'd never fought to know one. To know this one, he had to set himself above all compassion. And he wasn't certain he could do it. Duncan. Where was Idaho in this shape to measure flesh? It wasn't flesh. It was a shroud in fleshy shape. Idaho lay dead forever on the floor of an Arakean cavern. His ghost stared out of metal eyes. Two beings stood side by side in this revenant flesh. One was a threat with its force and nature hidden behind unique veils. Closing his eyes, Paul allowed old visions to sift through his awareness. He sensed the spirits of love and hate spouting there in a rolling sea from which no rock lifted above the chaos, no place at all from which to survey turmoil. Why has no vision shown me this new Duncan Idaho? He asked himself. What concealed time from an oracle? Other oracles, obviously. Paul opened his eyes, asked, "Hey, do you have the power of prescience?" "No, my lord." Sincerity spoke in that voice. It was possible the Gola didn't know he possessed this ability, of course, but that'd hamper his working as a mentat. What was the hidden design? Old vision surged around Paul. Would he have to choose the terrible way? Distorted time hinted at this Gola and that hideous future. Would that way close in upon him no matter what he did? Disengage, disengage, disengage. The thought told in his mind. In her position above Paul, Alia sat with chin cupped in left hand, stared down at the Gola. A magnetic attraction about this hay had reached up to her. Tleilaxu restoration had given him youth, an innocent intensity which called out to her. She'd understood Paul's unspoken plea. When oracles failed, one turned to real spies and physical powers. She wondered, though, at her own eagerness to accept this challenge. She felt a positive desire to be near this new man, perhaps to touch him. He's a danger to both of us, she thought. Truth suffers from too much analysis. Ancient Fremen saying. "Reverend Mother, I shudder to see you in such circumstances," Irulan said. She stood just inside the cell door, measuring the various capacities of the room in a Bene Gesserit way. It was a 3-meter cube carved of cut arrays from the veined brown rock beneath Paul's keep. For furnishings, it contained one flimsy basket chair occupied now by the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mahaim, a pallet with a brown cover upon which had been spread a deck of the new Dune tarot cards, a metered water tab above a reclamation basin, a Fremen privy with moisture seals. It was all sparse, primitive. Yellow light came from anchored and caged glow globes at the four corners of the ceiling. "You've sent word to Lady Jessica?" the Reverend Mother asked. "Yes, but I don't expect her to lift one finger against her firstborn," Irulan said. She glanced at the cards. They spoke of the powerful turning their backs on supplicants. The card of the great worm lay beneath desolate sand. Patience was counselled. Did one require a tarot to see this? She asked herself. A guard stood outside watching them through a metaglass window in the door. Irulan knew there'd be other monitors on this encounter. She had put in much thought and planning before daring to come here. To have stayed away carried its own perils, though. The Reverend Mother had been engaged in prajna meditation, interspersed with examinations of the tarot. Despite her feeling that she would never leave Arrakis alive, she had achieved a measure of calm through this. One's oracular powers might be small, but muddy water was muddy water, and there was always the litany against fear. She had yet to assimilate the import of the actions which had precipitated her into this cell. Dark suspicions brooded in her mind, and the tarot hinted at confirmations. Was it possible the guild had planned this? A yellow-robed Kizara, head shaved for a turban, beady eyes of total blue and a bland round face, skin leathered by the wind and sun of Arrakis, had awaited her on the Highliner's reception bridge. He had looked up from a bulb of spiced coffee being served by an obsequious steward, studied her a moment, put down the coffee bulb. "You are the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mahaim?" To replay those words in her mind was to bring that moment alive in the memory. Her throat had constricted with an unmanageable spasm of fear. How had one of the Emperor's minions learned of her presence on the Highliner? "It came to our attention that you were aboard," the Kizara said. "Have you forgotten that you were denied permission to set foot on the Holy Planet?" I am not on Arrakis," she said. "I'm a passenger on a guild Highliner in free space." "There is no such thing as free space, madam." She read hate mingled with profound suspicion in his tone. "Muad'Dib rules everywhere," he said. "Arrakis is not my destination," she insisted. "Arrakis is the destination of everyone," he said, and she feared for a moment that he would launch into a recital of the mystical itinerary which pilgrims followed. This very ship had carried thousands of them. But the Kizara had pulled a golden amulet from beneath his robe, kissed it, touched it to his forehead and placed it to his right ear, listened. Presently he restored the amulet to its hidden place. "You are ordered to gather your luggage and accompany me to Arrakis, but I have business elsewhere." In that moment she suspected guild perfidy, or exposure, through some transcendent power of the Emperor or his sister. Perhaps the steersman did not conceal the conspiracy after all. The abomination, Alia, certainly possessed the abilities of Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother. What happened when those powers were coupled with the forces which worked in her brother? At once, the Kizara snapped. Everything in her cried out against setting foot once more on that accursed desert planet. Here is where the Lady Jessica had turned against the Sisterhood. Here was where they'd lost Paul Atreides, the Kwisatz Haderach they'd sought through long generations of careful breeding. At once, she agreed. There's little time, the Kizara said. When the Emperor commands, all his subjects obey. So the order had come from Paul. She thought of protesting to the Highliner's navigator-commander, but the futility of such a gesture stopped her. What could the guild do? The Emperor has said I must die if I set foot on Dune, she said, making a last desperate effort. You spoke of this yourself. You are condemning me if you take me down there. Say no more, the Kizara ordered. The thing is ordained. That was how they always spoke of imperial commands, she knew. Ordained. The holy ruler whose eyes could pierce the future had spoken. What must be, must be. He had seen it, had he not? With the sick feeling that she was caught in a web of her own spinning, she had turned to obey. And the web had become a cell which Irulan could visit. She saw that Irulan had aged somewhat since their meeting on Wallach 9. New lines of worry spread from the corners of her eyes. Well, time to see if this sister of the Bene Gesserit could obey her vows. I've had worse quarters, the Reverend Mother said. Do you come from the Emperor? And she allowed her fingers to move as though in agitation. Irulan read the moving fingers, and her own fingers flashed an answer as she spoke, saying, No, I came as soon as I heard you were here. Won't the Emperor be angry? The Reverend Mother asked. Again, her fingers moved, imperative, pressing, demanding. Let him be angry. You are my teacher in the sisterhood, just as you are the teacher of his own mother. Does he think I will turn my back on you as she has done? And Irulan's finger talk made excuses, begged. The Reverend Mother sighed. On the surface it was the sigh of a prisoner bemoaning her fate, but inwardly she felt the response as a comment on Irulan. It was futile to hope the Atreides Emperor's precious gene pattern could be preserved through this instrument. No matter her beauty, this princess was flawed. Under the veneer of sexual attraction lived a whining shrew, more interested in words than in actions. Irulan was still a Bene Gesserit, though, and the Sisterhood reserved certain techniques to use in some of its weaker vessels as assurance that vital instructions would be carried out. Beneath small talk about a softer palate, better food, the Reverend Mother brought up her arsenal of persuasion and gave her orders. The brother-sister crossbreeding must be explored. Irulan was broke at receiving this command. I must have my chance, Irulan's fingers pleaded. You've had your chance, the Reverend Mother countered, and she was explicit in her instructions. Was the Emperor ever angry with his concubine? His unique powers must make him lonely. To whom could he speak in any hope of being understood? To the sister, obviously. She shared this loneliness. The depth of their communion must be exploited. Opportunities must be created to throw them together in privacy. Intimate encounters must be arranged. The possibility of eliminating the concubine must be explored. Grief to solve traditional barriers. Irulan protested. If Chani was killed, suspicion would fasten immediately upon the princess consort. Besides, there were other problems. Chani had fastened upon an ancient Fremen diet supposed to promote fertility, and the diet eliminated all opportunity for administering the contraceptive drugs. Lifting the suppressives would make Chani even more fertile. The Reverend Mother was outraged and concealed it with difficulty while her fingers flashed their demands. Why had this information not been conveyed at the beginning of their conversation? How could Irulan be that stupid? If Chani conceived and bore a son, the Emperor would declare the child to be his heir. Irulan protested that she understood the dangers, but the genes might not be totally lost. Damn such stupidity, the Reverend Mother raged. Who knew what suppressions and genetic entanglements Chani might introduce from her wild Fremen strain? The sisterhood must have only the pure line, and an heir would renew Paul's ambitions, spur him to new efforts in consolidating his empire. The conspiracy could not afford such a setback. Defensively, Irulan wanted to know how she could have prevented Chani from trying this diet. But the Reverend Mother was in no mood for excuses. Irulan received explicit instructions how to meet this new threat. If Chani conceived, an abortifact must be introduced into her food or drink. Either that or she must be killed. An heir to the throne from that source must be prevented at all costs. An abortifact would be as dangerous as an open attack on the concubine. Irulan objected. She trembled at the thought of trying to kill Chani. Was Irulan deterred by danger? The Reverend Mother wanted to know, her finger talk conveying deep scorn. Angered, Irulan signaled that she knew her value was an agent in the royal household. Did the conspiracy wish to waste such a valuable agent? Was she to be thrown away? In what other way could they keep this close a watch on the Emperor? Or had they introduced another agent into the household? Was that it? Was she to be used now, desperately, and for the last time? In a war, all values acquired new relationships, the Reverend Mother countered. Their greatest peril was that House Atreides should secure itself with an imperial line. The sisterhood could not take such a risk. This went far beyond the dangers of the Atreides genetic pattern. Let Paul anchor his family to the throne, and the sisterhood could look forward to centuries of disruption for its programs. Irulan understood the argument, but she couldn't escape the thought that a decision had been made to spend the princess consort for something of great value. Was there something she should know about the Ghola? Irulan ventured. The Reverend Mother wanted to know if Irulan thought the sisterhood composed of fools. When had they ever failed to tell Irulan all she should know? It was no answer, but an admission of concealment, Irulan saw. It said she would be told no more than she needed to know. How could they be certain the Gola was capable of destroying the Emperor? Irulan asked. She could just as well have asked if Malange was capable of destruction, the Reverend Mother countered. It was a rebuke of a subtle message, Irulan realized. The Bene Gesserit whip that instructs informed her that she should have understood long ago this similarity between the spice and the Gola. Malange was valuable, but it exacted a price, addiction. It added years to a life, decades for some, but it was still just another way to die. The Gola was something of deadly value. The obvious way to prevent an unwanted birth was to kill the prospective mother before conception, the Reverend Mother signalled, returning to the attack. Of course, Irulan thought. If you decide to spend a certain sum, get as much for it as you can. The Reverend Mother's eyes, dark with the blue brilliance of her Malange addiction, stared up at Irulan, measuring, waiting, observing minutiae. She reads me clearly, Irulan thought with dismay. She trained me and observed me in that training. She knows I realize what decision has been taken here. She only observes now to see how I will take this knowledge. Well, I will take it as a Bene Gesserit and a princess. Irulan managed to smile, pulled herself erect, thought of the evocative opening passage of the Litany Against Fear. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. When calmness had returned, she thought, let them spend me. I'll show them what a princess is worth. Perhaps I'll buy them more than they expected. After a few more empty vocalizations to bind off the interview, Irulan departed. When she had gone, the Reverend Mother returned to her tarot cards, laying them out in the fire-ready pattern. Immediately, she got the Kwisatz Haderach of the major arcana, and the card lay coupled with the 8 of ships. The Sibyl hoodwinked and betrayed. These were not cards of good omen. They spoke of concealed resources for her enemies. She turned away from the cards, sat in agitation, wondering if Irulan might yet destroy them. The Fremen see her as the Earth Figure, a demi-goddess whose special charge is to protect the tribes through her powers of violence. She is Reverend Mother to their Reverend Mothers, the pilgrims who seek her out with demands that she restore virility or make the barren fruitful. She is a form of anti-mentat. She feeds on that strong human desire for the mysterious. She is living proof that the analytic has limits. She represents ultimate tension. She is the virgin harlot, witty, vulgar, cruel, as destructive in her whims as a Coriolis storm. Saint Alia of the Knife, as taken from the Irulan report. Alia stood like a black-robed sentinel figure on the south platform of her temple, the fane of the oracle which Paul's Fremen cohorts had built for her against a wall of his stronghold. She hated this part of her life, but knew no way to evade the temple without bringing down destruction upon them all. The pilgrims, damn them, grew more numerous every day. The temple's lower porch was crowded with them. Vendors moved among the pilgrims, and there were minor sorcerers, haruspicers, diviners, all working their trade in pitiful imitation of Paul Muad'Dib and his sister. Red and green packages containing the new Dune tarot were prominent among the vendors' wares, Alia saw. She wondered about the tarot. Who was feeding this device into the Arakeen market? Why had the tarot sprung to prominence at this particular time and place? Was it to muddy time? Spice addiction always conveyed some sensitivity to prediction. Fremen were notoriously fey. Was it an accident that so many of them dabbled in portents and omens here and now? She decided to seek an answer at the first opportunity. There was a wind from the southeast, a small leftover wind blunted by the scarp of the shield wall, which loomed high in these northern reaches. The rim glowed orange through a thin dust haze underlighted by the late afternoon sun. It was a hot wind against her cheeks, and it made her homesick for the sand, for the security of open spaces. The last of the day's mob began descending the broad greenstone steps of the lower porch, singly and in groups, a few pausing to stare at the keepsakes and holy amulets on the street vendors' racks, some consulting one last minor sorcerer. Pilgrims, supplicants, townfolk, Fremen, vendors closing up for the day. They formed a straggling line that trailed off into the palm-lined avenue which led to the heart of the city. Ali's eyes picked out the Fremen, marking the frozen looks of superstitious awe on their faces, the half-wild way they kept their distance from the others. They were her strength and her peril. They still captured giant worms for transport, for sport, and for sacrifice. They resented the off-world pilgrims, barely tolerated the townfolk of Graben and Pan, hated the cynicism they saw in the street vendors. One did not jostle a wild Fremen, even in a mob such as the ones which swarmed to Ali's fane. There were no knifings in the sacred precincts, but bodies had been found. Later. The departing swarm had stirred up dust. The flinty odour came to Alia's nostrils, ignited another pang of longing for the open, bled. Her sense of the past, she realized, had been sharpened by the coming of the Gola. There'd been much pleasure in those untrammeled days before her brother had mounted the throne. Time for joking, time for small things, time to enjoy a cool morning or a sunset. Time. Even danger had been good in those days. Clean danger from known sources. No need then to strain the limits of prescience, to peer through murky veils for frustrating glimpses of the future. Wild Fremen said it well. 4 things cannot be hidden: love, smoke, a pillar of fire, and a man striding across the open bled. With an abrupt feeling of revulsion, Alia retreated from the platform into the shadows of the fane, strode along the balcony which looked down into the glistening opalescence of her hall of oracles. Sand on the tiles rasped beneath her feet. Supplicants always tracked sand into the sacred chambers. She ignored attendants, guards, postulants, the Khizarates, omnipresent priest sycophants, plunged into the spiral passage which twisted upward to her private quarters. There, amidst divans, deep rugs, tent hangings, and mementos of the desert, she dismissed the Fremen Amazons Stilgar had assigned as her personal guardians, watchdogs more likely. When they had gone, muttering and objecting, but more fearful of her than they were of Stilgar, she stripped off her robe, leaving only the sheathed Kriz knife on its thong around her neck. Strewed garments behind her she made for the bath. He was near, she knew, that shadow figure of a man she could sense in her future, but could not see. It angered her that no power of prescience could put flesh on that figure. He could be sensed only at unexpected moments while she scanned the lives of others, or she came upon a smoky outline in solitary darkness when innocence lay coupled with desire. He stood just beyond an unfixed horizon, and she felt that if she strained her talents to an unexpected intensity she might see him. He was there, a constant assault on her awareness, fierce, dangerous, immoral. Moist warm air surrounded her in the bath. Here was a habit she had learned from the memory entities of the uncounted reverend mothers who were strung out in her awareness like pearls on a glowing necklace. Warm water in a sunken tub, accepted her skin as she slid into it. Green tiles of figures of red fish worked into a sea pattern surrounded the water. Such an abundance of water occupied this space that a Fremen of old would have been outraged to see it used merely for washing human flesh. He was near. It was lust in tension with chastity, she thought. Her flesh desired a mate. Sex held no casual mystery for a reverend mother who had presided at the siege orgies. The Tao awareness of her other selves could supply any detail her curiosity required. This feeling of nearness could be nothing other than flesh reaching for flesh. Need for action fought lethargy in the warm water. Abruptly, Alia climbed dripping from the bath, strode wet and naked into the training chamber which adjoined her bedroom. The chamber, oblong and skylighted, contained the gross and subtle instruments which turned a Bene Gesserit adept into ultimate physical and mental awareness/preparedness. There were mnemonic amplifiers, digit mills from X to strengthen and sensitize fingers and toes, odor synthesizers, tactility sensitizers, temperate gradient fields, pattern betrayers to prevent her falling into detectable habits, alpha wave response trainers, blink synchronizers to tone abilities in light/dark/spectrum analysis. In 10-centimeter letters along one wall, written by her own hand in mnemonic paint, stood the key reminder from the Bene Gesserit Creed. Before us, all methods of learning were tainted by instinct. We learned how to learn. Before us, instinct-ridden researchers possessed a limited attention span, often no longer than a single lifetime. Projects stretching across 50 or more lifetimes never occurred to them. The concept of total muscle/nerve training had not entered awareness. As she moved into the training room, Alia caught her own reflection multiplied thousands of times in the crystal prisms of a fencing mirror swinging in the heart of a target dummy. She saw the long sword waiting on its brackets against the target, and she thought, yes, I'll work myself to exhaustion, drain the flesh and clear the mind. The sword felt right in her hand. She slipped the Kriz knife from its sheath at her neck, held it sinister, tapped the activating stud with the sword tip. Resistance came alive as the aura of the target shield built up, pushing her weapon slowly and firmly away. Prisms glittered. The target slipped to her left. Alia followed with the tip of the long blade, thinking as she often did that the thing could almost be alive, but it was only servo motors in complex reflector circuits designed to lure the eyes away from danger, to confuse and teach. It was an instrument geared to react as she reacted, an anti-self which moved as she moved, balancing light on its prisms, shifting its target, offering its counterblade. Many blades appeared to lunge at her from the prisms, but only one was real. She counted the real one, slipped the sword past shield resistance to tap the target. A marker light came alive, red and glistening among the prisms. More distraction. Again the thing attacked, moving at one marker speed now, just a bit faster than it had in the beginning. She parried and, against all caution, moved into the danger zone, scored with the Kriz knife. 2 lights glowed from the prisms. Again the thing increased speed, moving out on its rollers, drawn like a magnet to the motions of her body and the tip of her sword. Attack, parry, counter. Attack, parry, counter. She had 4 lights alive in there now, and the thing was becoming more dangerous, moving faster with each light, offering more areas of confusion. 5 lights. Sweat glistened on her naked skin. She existed now in a universe whose dimensions were outlined by the threatening blade, the target, bare feet against the practice floor, sense/nerves/muscles, motion against motion, attack, parry, counter. 6 lights. 7. 8. She had never before risked 8. In a recess of her mind there grew a sense of urgency, a crying out against such wildness as this. The instrument of prisms and target could not think, feel caution or remorse, and it carried a real blade. To go against less defeated the purpose of such training. That attacking blade could maim and it could kill, but the finest swordsmen in the Imperium never went against more than 7 lights. 9. Alia experienced a sense of supreme exaltation. Attacking blade and target became blurs among blurs. She felt that the sword in her hand had come alive. She was an anti-target. She did not move the blade, it moved her. 10. 11. Something flashed past her shoulder, slowed at the shield aura around the target, slid through and tripped the deactivating stud. The lights darkened. Prisms and target twisted their way to stillness. Alia whirled, angered by the intrusion, but her reaction was thrown into tension by awareness of the supreme ability which had held the knife. That knife, it had been a throw timed to exquisite nicety, just fast enough to get through the shield zone and not too fast to be deflected. It had touched a 1mm spot within 11 light target. Alia found her own emotions and tensions running down in a manner not unlike that of the target dummy. She was not at all surprised to see who had thrown the knife. Paul stood just inside the training room doorway, Stilgar 3 steps behind him. Her brother's eyes are squinted in anger. Alia, growing conscious of her nudity, fought to cover herself, found the idea amusing. What the eyes had seen could not be erased. Slowly she replaced the Chris knife in its sheath at her neck. I might have known, she said. I presume you know how dangerous that was, Paul said. He took his time reading the reactions on her face and body, the flush of her exertions colouring her skin, the wet fullness of her lips. There was a disquieting femaleness about her that he had never considered in his sister. He found it odd that he could look at a person who was this close to him and no longer recognise her in the identity framework which had seemed so fixed and familiar. That was madness, Stilgar rasped, coming up to stand beside Paul. The words were angry, but Alia heard awe in his voice, saw it in his eyes. 11 lights, Paul said, shaking his head. I'd have made it 12 if you hadn't interfered, she said. She began to pale under his close regard, added, And why do the damned things have that many lights if we're not supposed to try for them? A Bene Gesserit should ask the reasoning behind an open-ended system, Paul asked. I suppose you never tried for more than 7, she said, anger returning. His attentive posture began to annoy her. Just once, Paul said. Gurney Halleck caught me on 10. My punishment was sufficiently embarrassing that I won't tell you what he did. And speaking of embarrassment, next time perhaps you'll have yourselves announced, she said. She brushed past Paul into the bedroom, found a loose grey robe, slipped into it, began brushing her hair before a wall mirror. She felt sweaty, sad, a post-coitum kind of sadness that left her with a desire to bathe once more, and to sleep. Why are you here? She asked. My lord, Stilgar said. There was an odd inflection in his voice that brought Alia around to stare at him. We're here at Irulan's suggestion, Paul said, as strange as that may seem. She believes, and information in Stil's possession appears to confirm it, but our enemies are about to make a major try for... My lord, Stilgar said, his voice sharper. As her brother turned, questioning, Alia continued to look at the old Fremen Naib. Something about him now made her intensely aware that he was one of the primitives. Stilgar believed in a supernatural world very near him. It spoke to him in a simple pagan tongue, dispelling all doubts. The natural universe in which he stood was fierce, unstoppable, and it lacked the common morality of the Imperium. Yes, Stil, Paul said. Do you want to tell her why we came? This isn't the time to talk of why we came, Stilgar said. What's wrong, Stil? Stilgar continued to stare at Alia. Sire, are you blind? Paul turned back to his sister, a feeling of unease beginning to fill him. Of all his aides, only Stilgar dared to speak to him in that tone. But even Stilgar measured the occasion by its need. This one must have a mate, Stilgar blurted. There'll be trouble if she's not wed, and that soon. Alia whirled away, her face suddenly hot. How did he touch me? She wondered. Bene Gesserit self-control had been powerless to prevent her reaction. How had Stilgar done that? He hadn't the power of the voice. She felt dismayed and angry. Listen to the great Stilgar, Alia said, keeping her back to them, aware of a shrewish quality in her voice and unable to hide it. Advice to maidens from Stilgar, the Fremen. As I love you both, I must speak. Stilgar said, a profound dignity in his tone. I did not become a chieftain among the Fremen by being blind to what moves men and women together. One needs no mysterious powers for this. Paul weighed Stilgar's meaning, reviewed what they had seen here, and his own undeniable male reaction to his own sister. Yes, there had been a ruddish air about Alia, something wildly wanton. What had made her enter the practice floor in the nude? and whisking her life in that foolhardy way. 11 lights in the fencing prisms. That brainless automaton loomed in his mind with all the aspects of an ancient horror creature. Its possession was the shibboleth of this age, but it carried also the taint of old immorality. Once they'd been guided by an artificial intelligence, computer brains. The Butlerian jihad had ended that, but it hadn't ended the aura of aristocratic vice which enclosed such things. Stilgar was right, of course. They must find a mate for Alia. I will see to it, Paul said. Alia and I will discuss this later. Privately. Alia turned around, focused on Paul. Knowing how his mind worked, she realized she'd been the subject of a Mentat decision, uncounted bits falling together in that human-computer analysis. There was an inexorable quality to this realization, a movement like the movement of planets. It carried something of the order of the universe in it, inevitable and terrifying. Sire, Stilgar said, perhaps we'd... Not now, Paul snapped. We've other problems at the moment. Aware that she dared not try to match logic of her brother, Alia put the past few moments aside, Bene Gesserit fashion, said, Irulan sent you? She found herself experiencing menace in that thought. Indirectly, Paul said, the information she gives us confirms our suspicion that the Guild is about to try for a sandworm. They'll try to capture a small one and attempt to start the spy cycle on some other world, Stilgar said. It means they've found a world they consider suitable. It means they have Fremen accomplices, Alia argued. No off-worlder could capture a worm. That goes without saying, Stilgar said. No, it doesn't, Alia said. She was outraged by such obtuseness. Paul, certainly the rot is setting in, Paul said. We've known that for quite some time. I've never seen this other world, though, and that bothers me. If that bothers you? Alia demanded. Means only that they've clouded its location with steersmen the way they hide their sanctuaries. Stilgar opened his mouth, closed it without speaking. He had the overwhelming sensation that his idols had admitted blasphemous weakness. Paul, sensing Stilgar's disquiet, said, We have an immediate problem. I want your opinion, Alia. Stilgar suggests we expand our patrols in the open bled and reinforce the siege. It's just possible we could spot a landing party and prevent with the steersmen guiding them, Alia asked. They are desperate, aren't they? Paul agreed. That is why I'm here. What have they seen that we haven't? Alia asked. Precisely. Alia nodded, remembering her thoughts about the new Dune tarot. Quickly she recounted her fears. Throwing a blanket over us, Paul said. With adequate patrols, Stilgar ventured, we prevent nothing. Forever, Alia said. She didn't like the feel of the way Stilgar's mind was working now. He had narrowed his scope, eliminated obvious essentials. This was not the Stilgar she remembered. We must count on their getting a worm, Paul said. Whether they can start the Melange cycle on another planet is a different question. They'll need more than a worm. Stilgar looked from brother to sister. Out of ecological thinking that had been ground into him by siege life, he grasped their meaning. A captive worm couldn't live except within a bit of Arrakis. Sand plankton, little makers and all. The Guild's problem was large but not impossible. His own growing uncertainty lay in a different area. Then your visions do not detect the Guild at its work? He asked. Damnation! Paul exploded. Alia studied Stilgar, sensing the savage sideshow of ideas taking place in his mind. He was hung on a rack of enchantment. Magic. To glimpse the future was to steal terrifying fire from a sacred flame. It held the attraction of ultimate peril, souls ventured and lost. One brought back the formless, dangerous distances of something with form and power. But Stilgar was beginning to sense other forces, perhaps greater powers beyond that unknown horizon. His queen, witch, and sorcerer friend betrayed dangerous weaknesses. Stilgar, Alia said, fighting to hold him. You stand in a valley between dunes. I stand on the crest. I see where you do not see, and among other things, I see mountains which conceal the darkness. I see mountains which conceal the distances. There are things hidden from you, Stilgar said. This you've always said. All power is limited, Alia said. And danger may come from behind the mountains, Stilgar said. It's something on that order, Alia said. Stilgar nodded, his gaze fastened on Paul's face. But whatever comes from behind the mountains must cross the dunes. The most dangerous game in the universe is to govern from an oracular base. We do not consider ourselves wise enough or brave enough to play that game. The measures detailed here for regulation in lesser matters are as near as we dare venture to the brink of government. For our purposes we borrow a definition from the Bene Gesserit, and we consider the various worlds as gene pools, sources of teachings and teachers, sources of the possible. Our goal is not to rule, but to tap these gene pools, to learn and to free ourselves from all restraints imposed by dependency and government. The orgy is a tool of statecraft. Chapter 3 of the Steersman's Guide. Is that where your father died? Edric asked, sending a beam pointer from his tank to a jeweled marker on one of the relief maps adorning a wall of Paul's reception salon. That's the shrine of his skull, Paul said. My father died a prisoner on a Harkonnen frigate in the sink below us. Oh, yes, I recall the story now, Edric said. Something about killing the old Baron Harkonnen, his mortal enemy. Hoping he didn't betray too much of the terror which small enclosures such as this room imposed upon him, Edric rolled over in the orange gas, directed his gaze at Paul, who sat alone on a long divan of striped grey and black. My sister killed the Baron, Paul said, voice and manner dry, just before the Battle of Arrakeen. And why, he wondered, did the guild-man fish reopen old wounds in this place and at this time? The steersman appeared to be fighting a losing battle to contain his nervous energies. Gone were the languid fish motions of their earlier encounter. Edric's tiny eyes jerked here, there, questing and measuring. The one attendant who had accompanied him in here stood apart near the line of house guards, ranging the end wall at Paul's left. The attendant worried Paul, hulking, thick-necked, blunt and vacant face. The man had entered the salon, nudging Edric's tank along on a supporting field, walking with a strangler's gait, arms akimbo. Skytail, Edric had called him. Scytail, an aide. The aide's surface shouted stupidity, but the eyes betrayed him. They laughed at everything they saw. Your concubine appeared to enjoy the performance of the face dancers, Edric said. It pleases me that I could provide that small entertainment. I particularly enjoyed her reaction to seeing her own features simultaneously repeated by the whole troupe. Isn't there a warning against guildsmen bearing gifts? Paul asked, and he thought of the performance out there in the great hall. The dancers had entered in the costumes and guise of the Dune tarot, flinging themselves about in seemingly random patterns that devolved into fire eddies and ancient prognostic designs. Then had come the rulers, a parade of kings and emperors like faces on coins, formal and stiff in outline but curiously fluid. And the jokes, a copy of Paul's own face and body, Chani repeated across the floor of the hall, even Stilgar, who had grunted and shuddered while others laughed. But our gifts have the kindest intent, Edric protested. How kindly can you be? Paul asked. The goal you gave us believes he was designed to destroy us. Destroy you, sire? Edric asked, all bland attention. Can one destroy a god? Stilgar, entering on the last words, stopped, glared at the guards. They were much farther from Paul than he liked. Angrily, he motioned him closer. It's all right still, Paul said, lifting a hand. Just a friendly discussion. Why didn't you move the ambassador's tank over by the end of my divan? Stilgar, weighing the order, saw that it would put the steersman's tank between Paul and the hulking aide, much too close to Paul, but it's all right still, Paul repeated, and he gave the private hand signal which made the order an imperative. Moving with obvious reluctance, Stilgar pushed the tank closer to Paul. He didn't like the feel of the container or the heavily perfumed smell of melange around it. He took up a position at the corner of the tank beneath the orbiting device through which the steersman spoke. The killer god, Paul said. That's very interesting. But who says I'm a god? Those who worship you, Edric said, glancing pointedly at Stilgar. Is that what you believe? Paul asked. What I believe is of no moment, sire, Edric said. It seems to most observers, however, that you conspire to make a god of yourself, and one might ask if that is something that any mortal can do safely. Paul studied the guildsman, repellent creature, but perceptive. It was a question Paul had asked himself time and again, but he had seen enough alternate timelines to know of worse possibilities than accepting godhead for himself. Much worse. These were not, however, the normal avenues for steersmen to probe. Curious, why had that question been asked? What could Edric hope to gain by such effrontery? Paul's thoughts went flick. The association of Tleilaxu would be behind this move. Flick. The Jihad's recent Sembao victory would bear on Edric's action. Flick. Various Bene Gesserit credos showed themselves here. Flick. A process involving thousands of information bits poured flickering through his computational awareness. It required perhaps 3 seconds. Does a steersman question the guidelines of prescience? Paul asked, putting Edric on the weakest ground. This disturbed the steersman, but he covered well, coming up with what sounded like a long aphorism. No man of intelligence questions the fact of prescience, sire. Oracular vision has been known to men since most ancient times. It is a way of entangling us when we least suspect. Luckily there are other forces in our universe. Greater than prescience? Paul asked, pressing him. If prescience alone existed and did everything, sire, it would annihilate itself. Nothing but prescience? Where could it be applied except to its own degenerating movements? There's always the human situation, Paul agreed. A precarious thing at best, Edric said, without confusing it by hallucinations. Are my visions no more than hallucinations? Paul asked, mock sadness in his voice. Or do you imply that my worshippers hallucinate? Stilgar, sensing the mounting tensions, moved a step nearer Paul, fixed his attention on the guildsman reclining in the tank. You twist my words, sire, Edric protested. An odd sense of violence lay suspended in the words. Violence here? Paul wondered. They wouldn't dare, unless, and he glanced at his guards, the forces which protected him were to be used in replacing him. But you accuse me of conspiring to make a god of myself, Paul said, pitching his voice where only Edric and Stilgar might hear. Conspire? A poor choice of words. Word, perhaps, my lord, Edric said, but significant, Paul said. It says you expect the worst of me. Edric arched his neck, stared sideways at Stilgar with a look of apprehension. People always expect the worst of the rich and powerful, sire. It is said one can always tell an aristocrat. He reveals only those of his vices which will make him popular. A tremor passed across Stilgar's face. Paul looked up at the movement, sensing the thoughts and angers whispering in Stilgar's mind. How dared this guildsman talk thus to Muad'Dib? You're not joking, of course, Paul said. Joking, sire? Paul grew aware of the dryness in his mouth. He thought that there were too many people in this room, but the air he breathed had passed through too many lungs. The taint of melange from Edric's tank felt threatening. Who might accomplices be in such a superior conspiracy? Paul asked presently. Do you nominate a Kizarite? Edric shrugged, stirred the orange gas around his head. He no longer appeared concerned by Stilgar, although the Fremen continued to glare at him. Are you suggesting that my missionaries of the Holy Orders, all of them, are preaching subtle falsehood? Paul insisted. It could be a question of self-interest and sincerity, Edric said. Stilgar put a hand to the crysknife beneath the robe. Paul shook his head, said, Then you accuse me of insincerity. I am not sure that accuse is the proper word, sire. The boldness of this creature, Paul thought. And he said, Accused or not, you're saying my bishops and I are no better than power-hungry brigands. Power-hungry, sire? Again, Edric looked at Stilgar. Power tends to isolate those who hold too much of it. Eventually they lose touch of reality and fall. My lord, Stilgar growled, you've had men executed for less. Men, yes, Paul agreed, but this is a guild ambassador. He accuses you of an unholy fraud, Stilgar said. His thinking interests me still, Paul said. Contain your anger and remain alert, as Muad'Dib commands. Tell me, steersman, Paul said, how could we maintain this hypothetical fraud over such enormous distances of space and time without the means to watch every missionary, to examine every nuance in every Kizarite, priory, and temple? What is time to you? Edric asked. Stilgar frowned in obvious puzzlement, and he thought Muad'Dib has often said he sees past the veils of time. What is the guildsman really saying? Wouldn't the structure of such a fraud begin to show holes? Paul asked. Significant disagreements, schisms, doubts, confessions of guilt? Surely fraud could not suppress all these? What religion and self-interest cannot hide, governments can, Edric said. Are you testing the limits of my tolerance? Paul asked. Do my arguments lack all merit? Edric countered. Does he want us to kill him? Paul wondered. Is Edric offering himself as a sacrifice? I prefer the cynical view, Paul said, testing. You obviously are trained in all the lying tricks of statecraft, for double meanings in the power words. Language is nothing more than a weapon to you, and thus you test my armor. The cynical view, Edric said, a smile stretching his mouth, and rulers are notoriously cynical where religions are concerned. Religion, too, is a weapon. What manner of weapon is religion when it becomes the government? Paul felt himself grow inwardly still, a profound caution gripping him. To whom was Edric speaking? Damnable clever words, heavy with manipulation leverages, that undertone of comfortable humour, the unspoken air of shared secrets. His manner said he and Paul were two sophisticates, men of a wider universe who understood things not granted common folk. With a feeling of shock, Paul realised that he had not been the main target for all this rhetoric. This affliction visited upon the court had been speaking for the benefit of others, speaking to Stilgar, to the household guards, perhaps even to the hulking aide. Religious manner was thrust upon me, Paul said. I did not seek it. And he thought, there, let this man-fish think himself victorious in our battle of words. Then why have you not disavowed it, sire? Edric asked. Because of my sister Alia, Paul said, watching Edric carefully. She is a goddess. Let me urge caution where Alia is concerned, lest she strike you dead with her glance. A gloating smile began forming on Edric's mouth, was replaced by a look of shock. I am deadly serious, Paul said, watching the shock spread, seeing Stilgar nod. In a bleak voice, Edric said, You have mauled my confidence in you, sire, and no doubt that was your intent. Do not be certain you know my intent, Paul said, and he signalled Stilgar that the audience was at an end. To Stilgar's questioning gesture asking if Edric were to be assassinated, Paul gave a negative hand sign, amplified it with an imperative lest Stilgar take matters into his own hands. Sightail, Edric's aide, moved to the rear corner of the tank, nudged it toward the door. When he came opposite Paul, he stopped, turned that laughing gaze on Paul, said, If my lord permits? Yes, what is it? Paul asked, noting how Stilgar moved close in answer to the implied menace from this man. Some say, Sightail said, that people cling to imperial leadership because space is infinite. They feel lonely without a unifying symbol. For a lonely people, the Emperor is a definite place. They can turn toward him and say, "See, there he is. He makes us one." Perhaps religion serves the same purpose, my lord. Sightale nodded pleasantly, gave Edric's tank another nudge. They moved out of the salon. Edric supine in his tank, eyes closed. The steersman appeared spent, all his nervous energies exhausted. Paul stared after the shambling figure of Sightale, wondering at the man's words. A peculiar fellow, that Sightale, he thought. While he was speaking, he had radiated the feeling of many people, as though his entire genetic inheritance lay exposed on his skin. That was odd, Stilgar said, speaking to no one in particular. Paul arose from the divan as a guard closed the door behind Edric and the escort. Odd, Stilgar repeated. A vein throbbed at his temple. Paul dimmed the salon's lights, moved to a window which opened onto the angled cliff of his keep. Lights glittered far below. Pygmy movement. A work gang moved down there, bringing giant plasmold blocks to repair a facade of Alia's temple, which had been damaged by a freak twisting of a sandblast wind. That was a foolish thing, Usul, inviting that creature into these chambers, Stilgar said. Usul, Paul thought. My CH name. Stilgar reminds me that he ruled over me once, but he saved me from the desert. Why did you do it? Stilgar asked, speaking from close behind Paul. Data, Paul said. I need more data. Is it not dangerous to try meeting this threat only as a mentat? That was perceptive, Paul thought. Mentat computation remained finite. You couldn't say something boundless within the boundaries of any language. Mentat abilities had their uses, though. He said as much now, daring Stilgar to refute his argument. There's always something outside, Stilgar said. Something things best kept outside. Or inside, Paul said, and he accepted for a moment his own oracular/mentat summation. Outside, yes, and inside, here lay the true horror. How could he protect himself from himself? They certainly were setting him up to destroy himself, but this was a position hemmed in by even more terrifying possibilities. His reverie was broken by the sound of rapid footsteps. The figure of Corba the Kizara surged through the doorway, backlighted by the brilliant illumination in the hallways. He entered as though hurled by an unseen force and came to an almost immediate halt when he encountered the salon's gloom. His hands appeared to be full of Shiga wire reels. They glittered in the light from the hall, strange little round jewels that were extinguished as a guardsman's hand came into view, closed the door. "Is that you, my lord?" Corba asked, peering into the shadows. "What is it?" Stilgar asked. "Stilgar? We're both here. What is it?" "I'm disturbed by this reception for the guild's men." "Disturbed?" Paul asked. "The people say, my lord, that you honour our enemies." "Is that all?" Paul said. "Are those the reels I asked you to bring earlier?" He indicated the Shiga wire orbs in Corba's hands. "Reels? Oh, yes, my lord. These are the histories. Will you view them here?" "I viewed them. I want them for Stilgar here." "For me?" Stilgar asked. He felt resentment grow at what he interpreted as caprice on Paul's part. Histories. Stilgar had sought out Paul earlier to discuss the logistics computations for the Zabulon conquest. The guild ambassador's presence had intervened, and now, Corba with histories. "How much history do you know?" Paul mused aloud, studying the shadowy figure beside him. "My lord, I can name every world our people touched in their migrations. I know the reaches of Imperial, the Golden Age of Earth. Have you ever studied that?" "Earth? Golden Age?" Stilgar was irritated and puzzled. Why would Paul wish to discuss myths from the dawn of time? Stilgar's mind still felt crammed with Zabulon data, computations from the staff mentats, 205 attack frigates with 30 legions, support battalions, pacification cadres, Khizar 8 missionaries, the food requirements. He had the figures right here in his mind, and melange, weaponry, uniforms, medals, urns for the ashes of the dead, the number of specialists, men to produce raw materials for propaganda, clerks, accountants, spies, and spies upon the spies. "I brought the pulse synchronizer attachment also, my lord," Corba ventured. He obviously sensed the tensions building between Paul and Stilgar and was disturbed by them. Stilgar shook his head from side to side. Pulse synchronizer? Why would Paul wish him to use a mnemonic flutter system on a Shiga wire projector? Why scan for specific data and histories? This was mentat work. As usual, Stilgar found he couldn't escape a deep suspicion at the thought of using a projector and attachments. The thing always immersed him in disturbing sensations. An overwhelming shower of data which his mind sorted out later, surprising him with information he had not known he possessed. "Sire, I came with the Zabulon computations," Stilgar said. "Dehydrate the Zabulon computations," Paul snapped, using the obscene Fremen term which meant that here was moisture no man could demean himself by touching. "My lord, Stilgar," Paul said, "you urgently need a sense of balance which can come only from an understanding of long-term effects. What little information we have about the old times, the pittance of data which the Butlerians left us, Corba has brought it for you. Start with the Genghis Khan." "Genghis Khan? Was he of the Sardaukar, my lord? Oh, long before that. He killed perhaps 4,000,000. He must have had formidable weaponry to kill that many, sire. Lasbeams, perhaps, or he didn't kill them himself still. He killed the way I kill, by sending out his legions. There's another emperor I want you to note in passing. Hitler. He killed more than 6,000,000. Pretty good for those days. Killed. By his legions? Stilgar asked. Yes. Not very impressive statistics, my lord. Very good still. Paul glanced at the reels in Corba's hands. Corba stood with them as though he wished he could drop them and flee. Statistics. At a conservative estimate, I killed 61 billion, sterilized 90 planets, completely demoralized 500 others. I've wiped out the followers of 40 religions which had existed since. Unbelievers, Corba protested. Unbelievers all. No, Paul said. Believers. My liege makes a joke, Corba said, voice trembling. The jihad has brought 10,000 worlds into the shining light of into the darkness, Paul said. Will be 100 generations recovering from Muad'Dib's jihad. I find it hard to imagine that anyone will ever surpass this. A barking laugh erupted from his throat. What amuses Muad'Dib? Stilgar asked. I'm not amused. I merely had a sudden vision of the Emperor Hitler saying something similar. No doubt he did. No other ruler ever had your powers, Corba argued. Who would dare challenge you? Your legions control the known universe and all that the legions control, Paul said. I wonder if they know this. You control your legions, sire, Stilgar interrupted, and it was obvious from the tone of his voice that he suddenly felt his own position in that chain of command, his own hand guiding all that power. Having set Stilgar's thoughts in motion along the track he wanted, Paul turned his full attention to Corba, said, Put the reels here on the divan. As Corba obeyed, Paul said, How goes the reception, Corba? Does my sister have everything well in hand? Yes, my lord. Corba's tone was wary, and Chani watches from the spy hole. She suspects there may be Sardaukar in the guild entourage. No doubt she's correct, Paul said. The jackals gather. Banerjee, Stilgar said, naming the chief of Paul's security detail, was worried earlier that some of them might try to penetrate the private areas of the keep. Have they? Not yet. But there was some confusion in the formal gardens, Corba said. What sort of confusion? Stilgar demanded. Paul nodded. Strangers coming and going, Corba said, trampling the plants, whispered conversations. I heard reports of some disturbing remarks. Such as? Paul asked. Is this the way our taxes are spent? I'm told the ambassador himself asked that question. I don't find that surprising, Paul said. Were there many strangers in the gardens? Dozens, my lord. Banerjee stationed picked troopers at the vulnerable doors, my lord, Stilgar said. He turned as he spoke, allowing the salon's single remaining light to illuminate half his face. The peculiar lighting, the face, all touched a note of memory in Paul's mind, something from the desert. Paul didn't bother bringing it to full recall, his attention being focused on how Stilgar had pulled back mentally. The Fremen had a tight-skinned forehead which mirrored almost every thought flickering across his mind. He was suspicious now, profoundly suspicious of his emperor's odd behaviour. I don't like the intrusion into the gardens, Paul said. Courtesy to guests is one thing, and the formal necessities of greeting an envoy, but this, I'll see to removing them, Corba said, immediately. Wait! Paul ordered as Corba started to run. In the abrupt stillness of the moment, Stilgar edged himself into a position where he could study Paul's face. It was deftly done. Paul admired the way of it, an achievement devoid of any forwardness. It was a Fremen thing, slyness touched by respect for another's privacy, a movement of necessity. What time is it? Paul asked. Almost midnight, sire, Corba said. Corba, I think you may be my finest creation, Paul said. Sire! There was injury in Corba's voice. Do you feel awe of me? Paul asked. You are Paul Muad'Dib, who was useful in our siege, Corba said. You know my devotion to. Have you ever felt like an apostle? Paul asked. Corba obviously misunderstood the words, but correctly interpreted the tone. My emperor knows I have a clean conscience. Shai-Hulud save us, Paul murmured. The questioning silence of the moment was broken by the sound of someone whistling as he walked down the outer hall. The whistling was stilled by a guardsman's barked command as it came opposite the door. Corba, I think you may survive all this, Paul said, and he read the growing light of understanding on Stilgar's face. The strangers in the gardens, sire? Stilgar asked. Ah, yes, Paul said. Have Banerjee put them out still. Corba will assist. Me, sire? Corba betrayed deep disquiet. Some of my friends have forgotten they once were Fremen, Paul said, speaking to Corba, but designing the words for Stilgar. You will mark down the ones Chani identifies as Sardaukar, and you will have them killed. Do it yourself. I want it done quietly and without undue disturbance. You must keep in mind that there's more to religion and government than approving treaties and sermons. I obey the order of Muad'Dib, Corba whispered. The Zabulon computations? Stilgar asked. Tomorrow, Paul said. When the strangers are removed from the gardens, announce that the reception is ended. The party's over, still. I understand, my lord. I'm sure you do, Paul said. Here lies a toppled god. His fall was not a small one. We did but build his pedestal, a narrow and a tall one. Tlelaxu epigram. Alia crouched, resting elbows on knees, chin on fist, stared at the body on the dune, a few bones and some tattered flesh that once had been a young woman. The hands, the head, most of the upper torso were gone, eaten by the Coriolis wind. The sand all around bore the tracks of her brother's medics and questers. They were gone now, all excepting the mortuary attendants who stood to one side of Hayat, the gaoler, waiting for her to finish a mysterious perusal of what had been written here. A weak-coloured sky enfolded the scene in the glaucous light common to mid-afternoon for these latitudes. The body had been discovered several hours earlier by a low-flying courier whose instruments had detected a faint water trace where none should be. His call had brought the experts, and they had learned, what? That this had been a woman of about 20 years, Fremen, addicted to Samutar, and she had died here in the crucible of the desert from the effects of a subtle poison of Tleilaxu origin. To die in the desert was a common enough occurrence, but a Fremen addicted to Samutar, this was such a rarity that Paul had sent her to examine the scene in the ways their mother had taught them. Alia felt that she had accomplished nothing here except to cast her own aura of mystery about a scene that was already mysterious enough. She heard the gaoler's feet stir the sand, looked at him. His attention rested momentarily upon the escort, Fopters circling overhead like a flock of ravens. Beware of the guild bearing gifts, Alia thought. The mortuary Fopter in her own craft stood on the sand near a rock outcropping behind the gaoler. Focusing on the grounded Fopters filled Alia with a craving to be airborne and away from here. But Paul had thought she might see something here which others would miss. She squirmed in her stillsuit. It felt raspingly unfamiliar after all the suitless months of city life. She studied the gaoler, wondering if he might know something important about this peculiar death. A lock of his black goat hair, she saw, had escaped his stillsuit hood. She sensed her hand longing to truck that hair back into place. As though lured by this thought, his gleaming grey metal eyes turned toward her. The eyes set her trembling, and she tore her gaze away from him. A Fremen woman had died here from a poison called the Throat of Hell. A Fremen addicted to Samuda. She shared Paul's disquiet at this conjunction. The mortuary attendants waited patiently. This corpse contained not enough water for them to salvage. They felt no need to hurry, and then believed that Alia, through some glyptic art, was reading a strange truth in these remains. No strange truth came to her. There was only a distant feeling of anger deep within her at the obvious thoughts in the attendants' minds. It was a product of the damned religious mystery. She and her brother could not be people. They had to be something more. The Bene Gesserit had seen to that by manipulating Atreides' ancestry. Their mother had contributed to it by thrusting them onto the path of witchery, and Paul perpetuated the difference. The Reverend Mother, encapsulated in Alia's memory, stirred restlessly, provoking Adab flashes of thought. Peace, little one. You are what you are. There are compensations. Compensations. She summoned the gaoler with a gesture. He stopped beside her, attentive, patient. What do you see in this? She asked. We may never learn who was died here, he said. We may never learn who it was who died here, he said. The head, the teeth are gone. The hands, unlikely such a one had a genetic record somewhere which her cells could be to which her cells could be matched. Tleilaxu poison, she said. What do you make of that? Many people buy such poisons, true enough, and this flesh is too far gone to be regrown as was done with your body, even if you could trust a Tleilaxu to do it, he said. She nodded, stood. You will fly me back to the city now. When they were airborne and pointed north, she said, You fly exactly as Duncan Idaho did. He cast a speculative glance at her. Others have told me this. What are you thinking now? She asked. Many things. Stop dodging my question, damn you. Which question? She glared at him. He saw the glare, shrugged. How like Duncan Idaho, that gesture, she thought. Accusingly, her voice thickened with a catch in it. She said, I merely wanted your reaction's voice to play my own thoughts against them. That young woman's death bothers me. I was not thinking about that. What were you thinking about? About the strange emotions I feel when people speak of the one I may have been. May have been? The Tleilaxu are very clever. Not that clever. You were Duncan Idaho. Very likely. It's the prime computation. So you get emotional? To a degree. I feel eagerness. I'm uneasy. There's a tendency to tremble, and I must devote effort to controlling it. I get flashes of imagery. What imagery? It's too rapid to recognize. Flashes. Spasms. Almost memories. Aren't you curious about such memories? Of course. Curiosity urges me forward, but I move against a heavy reluctance. I think, what if I'm not the one they believe me to be? I don't like that thought. And this is all you were thinking? You know better than that, Alia. How dare he use my given name? She felt anger rise and go down beneath the memory of the way he'd spoken. Softly throbbing undertones, casual male confidence. A muscle twitched along her jaw. She clenched her teeth. Isn't that El Coods down there? He asked, tipping a wing briefly, causing a sudden flurry in their escort. She looked down their shadows rippling across the promontory above Haag Pass at the cliff and the rock pyramid containing the skull of her father, El Quds, the holy place. That's the holy place, she said. I must visit that place one day, she said. Nearness to your father's remains may bring memories I can capture. She saw suddenly how strong must be this need to know who he'd been. It was a central compulsion with him. She looked back at the rocks, the cliff with its base sloping into a dry beach and a sea of sand, cinnamon rock lifting from the dunes like a ship breasting waves. Circle back, she said. The escort, they'll follow. Swing under them. He obeyed. Do you truly serve my brother? She asked, when he was on the new course. The escort following. I serve the Atreides, he said, his tone formal, and she saw his right hand lift, fall, almost the old salute of Caladan. A pensive look came over his face. She watched him peer down at the rock pyramid. What bothers you? She asked. His lips moved. A voice emerged, brittle, tight. He was... A tear slid down his cheek. Alia found himself stilled by Fremenor. He gave water to the dead. Compulsively, she touched a finger to his cheek, felt the tear. Duncan, she whispered. He appeared locked to the Thopter's controls, gaze fastened to the tomb below. She raised her voice. Duncan. He swallowed, shook his head, looked at her, the metal eyes glistening. I felt an arm on my shoulders, he whispered. I felt it. An arm. His throat worked. It was a friend. It was my friend. Who? I don't know. I don't know. The call light began flashing in front of Alia, their escort captain wanting to know why they returned to the desert. She took the microphone, explained that they had paid a brief homage to her father's tomb. The captain reminded her that it was late. We'll go to Arrakeen now, she said, replacing the microphone. Haid took a deep breath, banked their Thopter around to the north. It was my father's arm you felt, wasn't it? She asked. Perhaps. His voice was out of the Mentat computing probabilities, and she saw he had regained his composure. Are you aware of how I know my father? She asked. I have some idea. Let me make it clear, she said. Briefly, she explained how she had awakened to Reverend Mother awareness before birth, a terrified fetus with the knowledge of countless lives embedded in her nerve cells, and all this after the death of her father. I know my father as my mother knew him, she said, in every last detail of every experience she shared with him. In a way, I am my mother. I have all her memories up to the moment when she drank the water of life and entered the trance of transmigration. Your brother explained something of this. He did? Why? I asked. Why? A Mentat requires data. Oh. She looked down at the flat expanse of the shield wall, tortured rock, pits and crevices. He saw the direction of her gaze, said, A very exposed place, that down there, but an easy place to hide, she said. She looked at him. It reminds me of a human mind, with all its concealments. Ah, he said. Ah? What does that mean? Ah. She was suddenly angry with him, and the reason for it escaped her. You'd like to know what my mind conceals, he said. It was a statement, not a question. How do you know I haven't exposed you for what you are by my powers of prescience? She demanded. Have you? He seemed genuinely curious. No. Sibyls have limits, he said. He appeared to be amused in this reduced Alia's anger. Amused? Have you no respect for my powers? She asked. The question sounded weakly argumentative even to her own ears. I respect your omen's importance perhaps more than you think, he said. I was in the audience for your morning ritual. And what does that signify? You've great ability with symbols, he said, keeping his attention on the Thopter's controls. That's a Bene Gesserit thing, I'd say. But as with many witches, you've become careless of your powers. She felt a spasm of fear, bled. How dare you? I dare much more than my makers anticipated, he said. Because of that rare fact, I remain with your brother. Alia studied the steel balls which were his eyes. No human expression there. The steel suit hood concealed the line of his jaw. His mouth remained firm, though, great strength in it, and determination. His words had carried a reassuring intensity. Dare much more. That was the thing Duncan Idaho might have said. Had the Tleilaxu fashioned their Gola better than they knew, or was this mere sham, part of his conditioning? Explain yourself, Gola, she commanded. Know thyself, is that thy commandment? He asked. Again she felt that he was amused. Don't bandy words with me, you thing, she said. She put a hand to the crisp knife in its throat sheath. Why were you given to my brother? Your brother tells me that you watched the presentation, he said. You've heard me answer that question for him. Answer it again. For me, I am intended to destroy him. Is that the Mentat speaking? You knew the answer to that without asking, he chided. And you know as well that such a gift wasn't necessary. Your brother already was destroying himself quite adequately. She weighed these words, her hand remaining on the haft of her knife. A tricky answer, but there was sincerity in the voice. Then why such a gift? She probed. It may have amused the Tleilaxu. And it is true that the guild asked for me as a gift. Why? Same answer. How am I careless of my powers? How are you employing them? He countered. His question slashed through to her own misgivings. She took her hand away from the knife, asked, Why do you say my brother was destroying himself? Oh, come now, child. Where are these vaunted powers? Have you no ability to reason? Controlling anger, she said, "Reason for me, Mentat." "Very well." He glanced around at their escort, returned his attention to their course. The plain of Arakeen was beginning to show beyond the northern rim of the shield wall. The pattern of the pan-engraven villages remained indistinct beneath a dust pall, but the distant gleam of Arakeen could be discerned. "Symptoms," he said. "Your brother keeps an official panegyrist who was a gift of the Fremen Nibes. An odd gift from friends," he said. "Why would they surround him with flattery and servility? Have you really listened to this panegyrist? The people are illuminated by Muad'Dib. The Umma regent, our emperor, came out of darkness to shine resplendently upon all men. He is our sire. He is precious water from an endless fountain. He spills joy for all the universe to drink. Pah!" Speaking softly, Alia said, If I but repeated your words for our Fremen escort, they'd hack you into bird feed. Then tell them, my brother rules by the natural law of heaven. You don't believe that, so I say it. How do you know what I believe?" She experienced trembling that no Bene Gesserit powers could control. This Gola was having an effect she hadn't anticipated. "You commanded me to reason as a Mentat," he reminded her. "No Mentat knows what I believe." She took 2 deep, shuddering breaths. "How dare you judge us?" "Judge you? I don't judge. You've no idea how we were taught. Both of you were taught to govern," he said. "You were conditioned to an overweening thirst for power. You were imbued with a shrewd grasp of politics and a deep understanding for the uses of war and ritual. Natural law? What natural law? That myth haunts human history. Haunts. It's a ghost. It's insubstantial, unreal. Is your jihad a natural law?" "Mentat Jabbar," she sneered. "I'm a servant of the Atreides and I speak with candor," he said. "Servant? We've no servants, only disciples. And I am a disciple of awareness," he said. "Understand that, child, and you, don't call me a child," she snapped. She slipped her cruise knife half out of its sheath. "I stand corrected." He glanced at her, smiled, returned his attention to piloting the Thopter. The cliff-sided structure of the Atreides keep could be made out now, dominating the northern suburbs of Arakeen. "You are something ancient in flesh that is little more than a child," he said, "and the flesh is disturbed by its new womanhood." "I don't know why I listened to you," she growled, but she let the cruise knife fall back into its sheath, wiped her palm on her robe. The palm, wet with perspiration, disturbed her sense of Fremen frugality, such a waste of the body's moisture. "You listen because you know I'm devoted to your brother," he said. "My actions are clear and easily understood. Nothing about you is clear and easily understood. You're the most complex creature I've ever seen. How do you know what the Tleilaxu built into you? By mistake or intent," he said. "They gave me freedom to mold myself." "You retreat into Zensuni parables," she accused. "The wise man molds himself. The fool lives only to die." Her voice was heavy with mimicry. "Disciple of awareness. Men cannot separate means and enlightenment," he said. "You speak riddles. I speak to the opening mind. I'm going to repeat all this to Paul. He's heard most of it already." She found herself overwhelmed by curiosity. "How is it you're still alive? And free? What did he say?" He laughed, and he said, "People don't want a bookkeeper for an emperor. They want a master, someone who'll protect them from change." But he agreed that destruction of his empire arises from himself. Why would he say such things? Because I convinced him I understand his problem and will help him. How could you possibly have said to do that? What could you possibly have said to do that? He remained silent, banking the Thopter into the downwind leg for a landing at the guard complex on the roof of the keep. "I demand you tell me what you said." "I'm not sure you could take it. I'll be the judge of that. I command you to speak at once. Permit me to land us first," he said, and not waiting for her permission, he turned onto the base leg, brought the wings into optimum lift, settled gently onto the bright orange pad atop the roof. "Now," Alia said, "speak." I told him that to endure oneself may be the hardest task in the universe. She shook her head. That's a bitter pill," he said, watching the guards run toward them across the roof, taking up their escort positions. "Bitter nonsense. The greatest Palatinate Earl and the lowliest stipendiary serf share the same problem. You cannot hire a Mentat or any other intellect to solve it for you. There's no writ of inquest or calling of witnesses to provide answers. No servant or disciple can dress the wound. You dress it yourself or continue bleeding for all to see." She whirled away from him, realizing in the instant of action what this betrayed about her own feelings. Without wile of voice or witch-wrought trickery, he had reached into her psyche once more. How did he do this? "What have you told him to do?" she whispered. "I told him to judge, to impose order." Alia stared out at the guard, marking how patiently they waited, how orderly. "To dispense justice," she murmured. "Not that," he snapped. "I suggested that he judge, no more, guided by one principle, perhaps, and that, to keep his friends and destroy his enemies. To judge unjustly, then. What is justice? Two forces collide. Each may have the right in his own sphere, and here's where an emperor commands orderly solutions. Those collisions he cannot prevent, he solves. How? In the simplest way. He decides. Keeping his friends and destroying his enemies. Isn't that stability? People want order, this kind or some other. They sit in the prison of their hungers and see that war has become the sport of the rich. That's a dangerous form of sophistication. It's disorderly. I will suggest to my brother that you are much too dangerous and must be destroyed, she said, turning to face him. A solution I've already suggested, he said. And that's why you are dangerous, she said, measuring out her words. You've mastered your passions. That is not why I'm dangerous. Before she could move, he leaned across, gripped her chin in one hand, planted his lips on hers. It was a gentle kiss, brief. He pulled away and she stared at him with a shock leavened by glimpses of spasmodic grins on the faces of her guardsmen still standing at orderly attention outside. Alia put a finger to her lips. There'd been such a sense of familiarity about that kiss. His lips had been flesh of a future she'd seen in some prescient byway. Breast heaving, she said, I should have you flayed. Because I'm dangerous? Because you presume too much. I presume nothing. I take nothing which is not first offered to me. Be glad I did not take all that was offered. He opened his door, slid out. Come along. We've dallied too long on a fool's errand. He strode toward the entrance dome beyond the pad. Alia leaped out, ran to match his stride. I'll tell him everything you've said and everything you did, she said. Good. He held the door for her. You'll order you executed, she said, slipping into the dome. Why? Because I took the kiss I wanted? He followed her, his movement forcing her back. The door slid closed behind him. The kiss you wanted. Outrage filled her. All right, Alia, the kiss you wanted, then. He started to move around her toward the drop field. As though his movement had propelled her into heightened awareness, she realized his candor, the utter truthfulness of him. The kiss I wanted, she told herself. True. Your truthfulness, that's what's dangerous, she said, following him. You return to the ways of wisdom, he said, not breaking his stride. Mentak could not have stated the matter more directly. Now, what is it you saw in the desert? She grabbed his arm, forcing him to a halt. He'd done it again, shocked her mind into sharpened awareness. I can't explain it, she said, but I keep thinking of the face dancers. Why is that? That is why you brother sent you to the desert, he said, nodding. Tell him of this persistent thought. But why? She shook her head. Why face dancers? There's a young woman dead out there, he said. Perhaps no young woman is reported missing among the Fremen.